Korea has been experiencing an extreme heat wave for weeks. We take a look at what's causing this and what to do to lower the risk of heat-related illnesses. Job figures increased by over 100,000 last month, but those in the construction sector sharply fell, affected by the extreme weather. Russia's border region of Belgorod has declared a state of emergency, blaming Ukraine's attack amid the Ukrainian incursion into neighboring Kursk. It's August 14th, 6 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Min. We start with an extreme heat wave that has been baking the country for weeks. So far, it has led to thousands of heat-related illnesses. Choi Soo-hyung covers the causes of the heat wave and what to do to stay safe.
South Korea is unbearably hot even at night. Tropical nights in Seoul, where temperatures remain above 25 degrees Celsius, have continued for 24 days since July 21st, marking the second longest stretch in history, just behind the 26 days recorded in 2018. So far, over 2,400 people have reported heat-related illnesses such as dizziness, fever, vomiting, muscle cramps, and severe headaches. 21 people have died. The Korea Meteorological Administration says a strong high-pressure system is covering the Korean peninsula.
In the mid-upper levels of the atmosphere above Korea, both the hot and humid North Pacific high-pressure system and the hot and dry Tibetan high-pressure system are firmly established. During the day, temperatures rise further due to sunlight, leading to the heat wave.
So far, the average day high for Seoul this August has been 33.7 degrees Celsius, with temperatures peaking on Tuesday, August 13th, when they reached 36.4 degrees. Experts say climate change and the geographical characteristics of the Korean peninsula are the main factors behind this.
The ongoing heat wave is due to changing climate patterns. While similar heat waves have occurred in the past, the combination of heat, humidity, and rainfall during the summer is partly due to the geographical characteristics of the country.
He also emphasized that urban residents are advised not to excessively use air conditioning and should use parasols outdoors and drink water frequently to lower the risk of the heat-related illnesses. In rural areas, especially for the elderly, it's important to avoid working outdoors during the daytime as the extreme heat can be life-threatening. Professor Moon predicts that summers will become hotter and more humid each year. He also said long-term measures are necessary to deal with urban heat, including ventilation and airflow systems between buildings. He also suggested creating green cities by planting vines on building exteriors and establishing rooftop gardens.
We need to create more urban forests, plant more trees in living areas, grow vines on building walls, and establish green rooftops. These efforts can reduce the urban heat island effect and absorb carbon dioxide.
The KMA expects this summer heat wave to continue until around August 23rd. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
The number of COVID-19 cases has sharply gone up due to a summer resurgence of the virus, especially among children. Our Yoon, he looks into why it's happening and ways to avoid the virus.
There's a notable summer spread of COVID-19 as people return from vacation. Enough time has passed since the height of the pandemic, and people are less focused on vaccinations and maintaining adequate antibody levels.
I think namely, people becoming less worried about how COVID could affect their lives, keeping less of the, sanitary measures and, to protect themselves and also protect others.
The professor noted that antibodies from past vaccinations have likely waned by now, contributing to the recent surge. However, the alert level being downgraded and the removal of most preventive measures have left a gap in guidelines when it comes to confirmed cases. This has resulted in symptomatic individuals avoiding testing and those who test positive continuing their daily activities, including going to work. The Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency predicts that COVID-19 cases will likely peak in late August. This is because over the past 4 weeks, hospitalizations have nearly doubled each week, resulting in over 800 cases in the first week of August. Concerns are rising, with most schools in South Korea scheduled to start their second semester from mid-August to early September, while the number of child patient cases has also surged nearly 2.8 times in the past 2 weeks. This is according to the Korea Pediatric Hospital Association on Wednesday, reporting that the number of pediatric COVID-19 cases at 42 member hospitals surged from around 300 to over 1,000 between late July and early August.
So when we go into public spaces where a lot of the people are, being together, unknowingly and without recognizing myself actually carrying the disease, I could spread the virus to another person who could be affected in a life and death manner. So let's just remember that.
The weather is hot and humid, but staying in air-conditioned spaces can increase virus transmission. The professor advises avoiding crowded, enclosed places, and if that's not possible, keeping windows open for ventilation, even if using an air conditioner. Also, wearing a mask when experiencing respiratory symptoms can help prevent the spread of the disease. Yoon, Arirang News.
President Yoon has pledged to build a solid foundation for future generations to prosper, based on the spirit and legacy of South Korea's independence activists. This came as the president hosted a luncheon for more than 100 descendants of the country's freedom fighters on Wednesday, a day before August 15th, which marks the day South Korea gained liberation from Japan's colonization 79 years ago. Yoon emphasized the sacrifices and dedication of the independence activists who helped bring freedom and said his government will devote all efforts to building freedom, peace, and prosperity. In other news, July's employment expanded well over 100,000 on year, but figures in the construction sector sharply fell, affected by the extreme weather. Lee Soo-jin has the details.
South Korea saw job figures increase on year by more than 100,000 for the first time in 3 months in July. Data released by Statistics Korea on Wednesday shows that there were 28.8 million people in employment last month, up 172,000 from the previous year. This comes after the on-year job growth was below 100,000 for both May and June. The rate of employment for people aged 50 and above rose by 0.1 percentage points on year to 63.3%, which is the highest figure for any month of July on record. And July's unemployment rate stood at 2.5%, 0.2 percentage points lower compared to the same month last year. But the rise in the job market was mainly driven by those aged 60 and above, with 278,000 more people in that age group in jobs in July compared to last year. On the other hand, for those between 15 and 29 years old, employment fell by 149,000 on year. And despite the overall growth in terms of job sectors, employment figures in the construction sector fell by a whopping 81,000. This marks the largest on-year drop for the month of July since 2013.
There has been a downward trend for about 3 months, and the decline has widened. The extreme heat and heavy rain, as well as a greater decline in specialized construction contracts, have all contributed to the overall decline in the construction sector.
And employment in the manufacturing sector, which has been seeing an upward trend, also fell by 11,000 in July, with the largest drop seen in those aged 40 and below. During a job task force meeting on Wednesday, the first vice finance minister acknowledged that while overall employment figures were positive, pan-governmental efforts are needed to address the sluggish employment figures in sectors such as construction, as well as among young people. He announced that measures including livelihood assistance and job training will be strengthened, and that pilot programs for youth employment that include connecting college students to alumni will be carried out starting this month. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
South Korea's fiscal deficit in the first half of the year is already larger than the deficit forecast the government had made for the whole year. Data from the Finance Ministry released on Wednesday show that the so-called managed fiscal balance, which excludes social security funds like the national pension, was more than 103 trillion won, or around $76 billion into the red for the January to June period. The deficit has already surpassed the forecast of $67 billion set by the government for the whole year. The ministry attributed this to a drop in tax revenue driven by a fall in corporation taxes. On the international front, Russia's border region of Belgorod declared an emergency citing Ukrainian attacks. Kyiv, meanwhile, says it has taken control of parts of Russian territory in Kursk as Moscow hits back. Cha Yoon has the latest.
The governor of Russia's border region of Belgorod, Vyacheslav Gladkov, declared a state of emergency on Wednesday, saying Ukrainian shelling is making the situation extremely difficult and tense by destroying homes and killing civilians. The declaration came after Belgorod began evacuations on Monday as a result of Ukrainian advances following Kyiv's surprise incursion into the neighboring Kursk region last week. According to Reuters, regional authorities are now appealing to the Russian government to declare a federal emergency. Kyiv says it has captured 74 villages in the Kursk region and has vowed to stop its offensives in Russia if Moscow agrees to a fair peace deal. Ukraine continued to push ahead with its offensive in Russia's Kursk region for the 8th day on Tuesday. A top Ukrainian commander said that its forces were able to advance 3 kilometers in one day, taking control of an additional 40 square kilometers of Russian territory. AFP News reported that Ukraine is in control of at least 800 square kilometers of mainland of Russia after analyzing resources from Institute of the Study of War. However, Moscow says it's in the process of pushing back the Ukrainian military. The Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine has already lost up to 420 troops in the past 24 hours, and over 2,000 soldiers have been killed since the incursions began last Tuesday. While the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry called on Russia to agree to restore peace in the 2.5-year-long war, Russian President Vladimir Putin a day earlier said no negotiations could happen with those that attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, slamming the 8-day-long incursion. Cha Yoon, Arirang News.
Turning to the Middle East, where tensions remain high, U.S. President Joe Biden says a peace deal between Israel and Hamas may serve to offset a planned assault by Iran against Israel. In the meantime, Hamas fired more rockets targeting Tel Aviv. Pei-Yun-ji with the latest.
Hamas has said it fired 2 rockets targeting Israel's Tel Aviv, but the Israeli military said one fell in the sea off the central city, while the other did not cross into the country's territory. Local media outlets said explosions were heard in the city on Tuesday local time, but no casualties were reported. Amid escalating tensions in the region, U.S. President Joe Biden has said Iran could hold off on a retaliatory strike on Israel if a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel is reached.
We'll see what Iran does and we'll see what happens if there's any attack. But I'm not giving up.
His remarks come after Iran vowed a severe response against Israel over the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, who was killed in Tehran after attending the Iranian president's inauguration. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also called on members of the Security Council to help finalize and implement a ceasefire agreement for Gaza.
The United States' overall goal remains to turn the temperature down in the region, deter and defend against any future attacks, and avoid regional conflict. That starts with finalizing a deal for an immediate ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza.
While a ceasefire deal still remains uncertain, the Palestinian leader has reportedly said Iran could soon decide whether or not to retaliate against Israel. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who's currently visiting Moscow, told Russia's TASS news agency on Tuesday local time that the decision could be made in the next few days, or even the next few hours. While adding that Palestinians are against war, he noted the U.S. is actively involved in ceasefire negotiations, although it's hard to foresee what will happen. 배은지, Arirang News.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will not be running for re-election as the president of his ruling Liberal Democratic Party in September. Kishida announced Wednesday that he is dropping out of the upcoming presidential race and will move on to supporting the election instead. The announcement comes amid mounting public discontent over Kishida's handling of a corruption scandal surrounding his party's unreported political funds. Kishida said that as the head of the party, he takes full responsibility for the serious situation. His 3-year term ends next month, and Japan will have a new prime minister after September's LDP election. In other news, Google has rolled out its new smartphones featuring an AI voice assistant earlier than usual as the AI race heats up. Yoon tells us more.
On Tuesday, at a product launch event at Alphabet's Bayview campus in California, Google unveiled new artificial intelligence features that are coming to Android devices. Its AI voice assistant, Gemini Live, has been completely rebuilt to provide a better assistant experience for users. With 10 new voices to choose from that serve to be more natural, conversational, and intuitive, Gemini can follow the user's train of thought and understand user intent. Google's Senior Vice President of Devices and Services, Rick Osterloh, said that Google was now bringing to reality the promise of AI.
The new Gemini assistant can go beyond understanding your words to understanding your intent, so you can communicate more naturally. It can synthesize large amounts of information in seconds and tackle complex tasks. It can draft messages for you, brainstorm with you, and give you ideas on how you can improve your work.
An analyst from global market intelligence firm, the International Data Corporation, said that Google nailed the two things that consumers are looking for AI to do, which is organization and content creation. The AI-powered technology will be available on its latest Pixel 9 series smartphones, which start at $799 US, $100 more than the Pixel 8. Holding less than 1% market share in global smartphone shipments, Google doesn't make a lot of money from its hardware business. But its latest feature could help drive revenue through its Gemini AI subscription program, which Android users can access for a monthly fee of $19.99. While Google normally announces its new lineup in the fall, pundits say the tech giant released its latest Pixel 9 lineup earlier than expected, with Apple's iPhone 16 scheduled for release next month. Google also announced new versions of its smartwatch, the Pixel Watch 3 and Pixel Buds Pro 2 wireless earbuds on Tuesday. Yoon, Arirang News.
On the cultural front, last month, a group of senior singers from Korea proved that the age is just a number at the World Choir Games, one of the most prestigious choir competitions in the world. Yesterday, they reunited for their first practice since winning the highest honor at the Games. Our culture correspondent Song Yoo-jin met with them.
The words gray and youth might not typically go together, but the Gray Youth Choir of Korea goes against those expectations. The choir of 55 members with an average age of 68 ranges from people in their 50s to late 80s. Among them are Korea's first harpist, a former news anchor, and even a 3-star general, all starting a new chapter of life with the choir. Some might remember the choir from the hit Korean reality show Qualifications of Men, where its members were chosen through a nationwide audition as part of the show's choir project back in 2011. This year, the Gray Youth Choir won the top award in the mixed senior choir category of the open competition at the World Choir Games, often called the Choir Olympics.
When we first started, we had one clear goal: to become the best senior choir in the world. We wanted to show not just the power of K culture, but the strength of K seniors. It took us 13 years to prepare for that 13-minute performance on the World Choir Games stage, but our patience paid off.
This victory didn't happen overnight. It's the result of more than a decade of hard work with performances at home and abroad, including the United Nations headquarters, Carnegie Hall, and Australia's International Choir Festival gov't. But their journey wasn't always smooth.
In the beginning, we trained for 3 months and entered our first choir competition, and that's how it all started. Back then, we were just a group of grandmas and grandpas, clueless about choir music, but determined to learn.
They overcame such hardships through the dedication of the members and their conductor. Remarkably, the choir practices and rehearses just once a week for 3 hours every Tuesday afternoon.
Our practice sessions have a 95% attendance rate, and if you miss 12 sessions a year, you're out of the choir. Our greatest strength is the dedication of our members.
Rehearsal is about coming together to harmonize, so individual practice is crucial. My focus has always been on motivating each person to practice at home so that our limited rehearsal time is as effective as possible.
The Grey Youth Choir's journey is far from over. They're planning a tour of 16 countries that participated in the Korean War and will continue singing with all their heart and passion towards an ultimate goal.
Our dream is to perform at Pyongyang Grand Theatre, uniting North and South Korea in song. It may seem like a distant hope now, but we believe that one day our choir will be part of history, marking the beginning of peace and unification on the Korean peninsula.
The Grey Youth Choir's journey is a story of vision, dedication, and the belief that age is no barrier to greatness.
When people hear us sing, they often ask, how can these seniors with an average age of 70 sing like a choir of 30-year-olds? Our message is simple: you too can remain young at heart.
True to their motto, active senior, as always, these active seniors and singers will continue to inspire the world, proving that anyone at any age can make their dreams come true. 송유진, 아리랑 뉴스.
The hottest heat of this summer appeared in Seoul yesterday, but couldn't cool down even overnight. As the tropical nights continue for 24 days in a row, it became the country's second longest streak of tropical nights ever. Today's Malbok, traditionally the last hot day of the year. The temperature in Seoul rose up to 35 degrees Celsius. The problem is that the heat is expected to continue day and night next week. Tomorrow there will be showers in northeastern Gyeonggi-do province, inland areas of Gangwon-do province, and southern parts of the Chungcheong-do provinces. The Seoul metropolitan area and western parts of Gangwon-do province will have around 30 millimeters per hour by today, and the same in Jeollanam-do province by tomorrow. Tomorrow, most areas will start off at least 24 degrees. Highs will move up to 34 in Seoul, Chuncheon, Daejeon, and Gwangju. Tropical nights and heat waves will continue, but with showers throughout the country. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
저희가 매일매일 자동차를 타고 일상생활에서도 쉽게 사용을 하는데 그런 자동차에서 타이어는 계속해서 버려지고 있거든요. 전 세계적으로 10억 개 이상 버려지고 있는데 특히 소각 처리될 경우에는 대기오염 물질들이 여러 가지가 나오게 되고 매립됐을 때는 지하수나 토양오염 물질들이 많이 방출되게 됩니다. 저희는 그런 타이어들을 어떻게 잘 처리할지 좀 고민을 했었습니다. 타이어가 가지고 있는 접지력이나 내마모성이 좀 우수하다고 생각을 했고요. 저희는 타이어 하나로 신발을 3.5켤레 정도를 만들 수가 있어요. 그렇게 됐을 때 저희의 신발 한 켤레는 타이어에서 발생되는 탄소를 8.9kg 정도 저감할 수 있는 그런 효과가 있습니다. 이 일을 시작하기 전에는 타이어가 그렇게 많이 버려지는지도 몰랐고 그리고 버려진 타이어들이 환경 파괴적으로 처분되는 것도 사실은 잘은 몰랐어요. 점점 더 적체가 되고 있거든요, 타이어들이. 시간이 지나면 지날수록 더 큰 문제가 될 것 같다는 생각에 지금 일을 하고 있습니다. 타이어마다 모양이나 패턴이 굉장히 많이 다양한데 내가 가지고 있는 신발이 다른 신발들과 모양이 다를 수 있다는 점, 그런 점도 그 재미 요소로 좀 다가가고 있습니다. 저희도 그런 계기를 보다 많은 분들께 하나 더 제공해 주고자 매일매일 신는 신발을 만들겠다고 한 것도 있어요. 조금 더 주변을 살펴보면은 나 스스로도 조금 더 환경 보호에 참여할 수 있는 일이나 물건들이 더 있지 않을까, 그렇게 찾아보시면 어떨까 싶습니다. 나는 다시 달릴 수 있게 만드는 그리너입니다.
Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Handarin Seoul. It's been almost a year since the leaders of South Korea, the United States, and Japan gathered in Camp David, a U.S. presidential retreat near Washington, for a summit that marked the beginning of a new era in trilateral cooperation. The historic summit yielded a joint statement that led to implementation of various measures in bolstering trilateral security ties, the efforts of which were formally institutionalized last month. But a swirl of challenges lie ahead amid evolving threats in the Indo-Pacific region, rising geopolitical tensions, and leadership uncertainties in both the U.S. and Japan. Camp David Summit 1 year in, progress and challenges. That's the topic of our discussion today. And joining us via Skype is Mason Ritchie, professor of international politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. It's always great to have you with us.
Great, thanks for having me.
We also have Pan Gil-ju, research professor at Korea University's Ilmin International Relations Institute, with us tonight. Always a great pleasure.
Hello, good to be here.
All right, Professor Pan, let's start off with you. This week marks the 1 year anniversary of the historic summit at Camp David, held between the leaders of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan. How would you evaluate the achievements and progress made so far in the three nations' security cooperation?
To be honest with you, it is true that the trilateral architecture between South Korea, the United States, and Japan, spurred by the Camp David summit, has been consolidated over the last year. As you might be aware, this trilateral political agreement has been transformed into TSCF, Trilateral Security Cooperation Framework, which means it has begun to be institutionalized. Likewise, high-ranking officials are scheduled to meet on a regular basis to enhance trilateral cooperation. The trilateral architecture has also contributed to enhancing their capacity to grapple with North Korea's nuclear threats. These three countries have activated a shared system to detect and assess North Korea's missile firings in real time. Moreover, they have begun to conduct trilateral combined exercises. The first trilateral exercise was carried out under the name of Freedom Edge in June 2024. As of right now, the trilateral architecture is not far from the level of full consolidated institutionalization, but at the same time, it is also true that this architecture has been advancing more rapidly than expected. Furthermore, the trilateral architecture between South Korea, the United States, and Japan has been recognized as the first unilateral framework made in Northeast Asia under the new corridor mechanism. So this framework has been paid attention to around the world. Meanwhile, a well-manageable level of cooperation and institutionalization shows that this framework smoothly goes on so far, which is eligible for the world's attention.
The U.S. has always wanted its two key allies, South Korea and Japan, to get along, right, to bolster security ties among the three nations. And although thorny issues remain, the trilateral defense cooperation seems stronger than ever before. And last month, as you briefly mentioned, Professor Pan, we saw another historic milestone in the three-way security partnership. Dr. Ritchie, there was a loud buzz about South Korea, the U.S., and Japan's institutionalization of their trilateral security framework. Tell us about its significance to the three nations' efforts to further boost security ties, and also share with us your perspectives on the controversies surrounding it.
Sure, thanks for having me. So as we just heard, the momentum for trilateral security and defense cooperation among Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo really picked up last year with the Camp David summit. And that covers cooperation in intelligence, defense, diplomacy, obviously, but also emerging technology, supply chain issues, for instance, in artificial intelligence and things like that. This is useful for deterring North Korea. And although this is the quiet part that you're not supposed to say out loud, it's also useful for deterring China, which is, of course, not very happy about this cooperative mechanism.
The worry, of course, is ultimately more about domestic politics in the three countries in terms of whether or not this trilateral cooperation can continue going forward. The most obvious risk from many people's point of view is what happens if Donald Trump wins. He's not a big fan of alliances. His relationship with South Korea last time was very rocky. His relationship with Japan was built around his relationship personally with Shinzo Abe, who has, of course, since passed away. And so there's some worry among some people that if Trump were to win the election later this year, that he would come in 2025 and not be very enthusiastic about this trilateral relationship, which is approaching the level of an alliance, of a trilateral alliance. We're probably not there yet in a strict definition, but in some ways, this is a budding or growing trilateral alliance. Of course, another risk is South Korea's presidential election in 2027. Yoon will be term limited out, so he can't run again for president. And so if there's a progressive president who moves into office in 2027 in South Korea, they may not be very interested in maintaining this trilateral relationship either. And then, of course, Japan. And now we know that Kishida is not going to stand for the party leadership position in Japan coming up in something like a month. And therefore, he's going to be out as prime minister very soon. And so there's a bit of a question mark over where Japan is going to be in terms of supporting this trilateral relationship. It's probably the least risky of the three in terms of undermining it, but it's not impossible. So these institutional mechanisms, we've heard Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State, talk about building out some type of formal secretariat to advance the trilateral. That would be a form of institutionalization. We know last month the defense secretaries met and put together a trilateral defense memorandum of cooperation. Although it's not legally binding internationally, it does set expectations for trilateral cooperation going forward. And then, of course, as the professor just put it, there's also informal elements such as expectations of leadership meetings at the leader level, at the minister level, at the vice minister level, in addition to the expectation of military exercises in a trilateral format going forward. So all of those things are meant in some ways to tie the hands of countries going forward, this three partners, so that it will be harder for them to undo this trilateral cooperation mechanism.
And as Professor Ritchie alluded to, Professor Pan, some are raising questions about the sustainability of the formally documented trilateral security pact, particularly amid U.S. election uncertainties and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's shaky leadership. As Professor Ritchie has mentioned, in fact, he announced today that he'll step down as the leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party next month, which means Japan will select a new prime minister. What are your prospects for the fate of the security framework?
Well, we cannot entirely exclude the possibility that a change in domestic politics negatively affects trilateral cooperation in the near future. The reason why the three countries rushed to make a coordinated effort for institutionalization is that it can help reduce this possibility. Meanwhile, this trilateral cooperation was attainable under the top-down approach, which was initiated by three leaders. In this sense, if domestic politics are changed, this architecture might be affected. In short, this type of top-down approach is rarely expected any longer if three leaders are gone or become weaker in their political power. In this vein, a key question should be whether a bottom-up approach can function as an alternative to a top-down approach in the era of post-three leaders. Again, institutionalization matters to make a bottom-up approach functional. Let me take a look at what it looks like in more detail. First of all, if Kishida's political position weakens or leadership changes in Japan, this trilateral cooperation might be on the list to re-examine, probably in the 1 or 2 months later type of things, whether this policy should continue to go on. The same worries goes to Japan toward South Korea. to put it another way, Japan is also skeptical of whether this trilateral cooperation can continue to go on under the post-Yoon administration. Despite this worry, it is also true that both South Korea and Japan come from North Korea's growing nuclear capability. This commonality, shared threat, is most likely to make decoupling between the two countries harder, even though domestic politics changes later on. American politics has a more complex formula. If Trump returns to the White House, he is most likely to adopt the approach eliminating all Biden policies. Meanwhile, the trilateral architecture might be excluded from the elimination list because this policy is under bipartisan support in the United States. Despite this fact, Trump might ask the other two countries for money if they want to make the trilateral architecture by applying a transactional approach. In contrast, if Harris wins the election, this trilateral architecture is more guaranteed for survival because she is most likely to follow Biden's policies. But at the same time, Harris is least likely to prioritize the issue of North Korea, similar to Biden's. To top it off, Harris might adopt strategic patience 3.0, which means its policy is less willing to directly tackle North Korean issues than before. In this sense, the trilateral architecture is likely to focus more on international issues, such as countering China or addressing climate change, than North Korean issues.
Thank you for that deep analysis, despite so many uncertainties and so many possible different scenarios. But it seems that having North Korea as the common shared threat will play an important role going forward, regardless of who takes power. Professor Ritchie, what are your prospects for the South Korea-U.S.-Japan trilateral security partnership going forward, and what could be some ways to maintain strong solidarity amid evolving threats from North Korea as well as Russia?
Yeah, so I first want to echo what Professor Pan just said. The threats that are represented by North Korea and China are, ultimately the driving force behind this trilateral cooperation. If you didn't have a nuclear-armed North Korea that's hostile to South Korea and the United States, and if you didn't have a revisionist China, there would be a lot less external pressure for South Korea, Japan, and the United States to cooperate in the security and defense sector together. And those threats aren't going away. So the incentives for this cooperative, trilateral relationship to continue are going to be there. That's looking at it from an external perspective. If you want to look at, the bottom up and top down issue, which again, I think is an important thing to consider, obviously there are risks on, who's going to be at the top going forward, as I talked about in my first response. But the militaries of all three countries are generally in favor of this type of cooperation. The security experts in the three governments are in favor of this. The intelligence agencies in the three governments are in favor of this. The diplomats in the three countries are generally in favor of this type of cooperation. So, I think that there's a strong, comprehensive, top to bottom support for this type of trilateral cooperation. I'll also just say, I also agree with the professor that I think there's a pretty good chance that if Trump comes in, he wouldn't simply scrap this type of trilateral cooperation. It might be put into a more transactional context. It might be called something different. They might rebadge it and rename it. But I think that there's a pretty decent chance that Trump and his team actually hold on to some of this. In fact, even a lot of it. As I said, part of that might be the institutionalization, but part of that is also that it has a lot of bipartisan support. There are, as I mentioned, however, some risks. One is potentially Trump. He can be mercurial, and he doesn't always listen to his advisors and his party. 2027 South Korean election, again, there's a risk that a progressive president comes in and doesn't pay attention to this type of trilateral As I mentioned, also, we're not sure who Kishida will follow Kishida in Japan. And there's I think a risk there, although a relatively minimal one. The other risk I think I'll point out is potential wedge driving between the partners. At some point, I expect China to try to break apart this trilateral relationship in some way, to pick on the weak link, so to speak, and try to undermine this trilateral relationship. North Korea will probably try that in some form or another, particularly if there's a progressive who comes into power in 2027 in South Korea. But overall, I think the prospects in the short to medium term for continuation of this trilateral security and defense cooperation is actually pretty good.
So you're quite optimistic about the sustainability of the framework, and perhaps we shouldn't be overly concerned about Trump's possible comeback. Now, Professor Pan, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan contributed a joint opinion piece to the Washington Post, touting boosted Seoul-Washington-Tokyo security ties as a major feat of President Biden's Indo-Pacific diplomacy. North Korea was quick to react, saying it only brought the people of South Korea and Japan closer to a nuclear war. How do you interpret this?
Well, the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan had been earlier seen as a final piece of getting things done by Washington, D.C. Well, in short, it was taken as almost impossible due to the estranged relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. Despite this fact, the trilateral cooperation is on the way right now. So the Biden administration wants to promote what it has accomplished, which had been regarded as an impossible task. Furthermore, the Biden administration believes that this promotion could be helpful for the upcoming presidential election in a situation where it is a tight race. When it comes to North Korea, Pyongyang's reaction could serve as an indicator. We can guess how effective the trilateral cooperation is in countering North Korean threats. It is too early to tell how effective it is because it is a just-born architecture. But one thing is for sure, as you mentioned earlier, North Korea strongly condemns this trilateral architecture, which was possible under a closer relationship between South Korea and Japan. Pyongyang even attempts nuclear coercion. This condemnation and coercion could hint that this architecture is burdensome to North Korea, and in doing so, serves as a deterrent power.
Now, Professor Ritchie, President Yoon is set to deliver a Liberation Day speech tomorrow, and he has made unprecedented efforts to mend strained ties between Korea and Japan since the launch of his administration. But historical feuds continue to stand in the way between the two countries. Japan's Sado mine, associated with Korea's wartime forced labor, was recently listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, once again angering the Korean people. In your view, how would President Yoon address Seoul-Tokyo relations in his speech against such a backdrop?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you and say I don't know what he's going to say. But if I were him, what I would do is largely downplay the Sado mine UNESCO heritage site issue. We have an expression in politics, especially domestic politics, and this speech is really more domestic politics than international politics. And that is, if you're explaining, you're losing. And so if Yoon wants to go down the road of explaining why South Koreans shouldn't be less upset or shouldn't be at all upset about the Sado mine being listed as a UNESCO heritage site and what that means for the recognition that Japan has and the acknowledgement that Japan shows for its World War II and colonial era war crimes, he's just going to get himself into a morass of explanations where he's not going to come out of this any politically better off. So if I were him, I would downplay this and I would simply say that, as a South Korean president, I will instruct, my diplomats and I will myself continue to press for South Korea's interests in general, and also in the specific case of Japan, and even more specifically with respect to the Sado mine issue. and we will never forego South Korea's interests, and we will do everything that we can to resolve satisfactorily for South Korea's interests these historical issues with Japan. But at the same time, we need a forward-looking approach on Japan. So I wouldn't go down the road of specifics on this. I wouldn't try to justify what South Korea's position on this UNESCO heritage site issue is. I would simply largely underscore the fact that he's there to protect South Korean interests, both historically and looking forward. Other than that, I think he's going to find himself doing a lot of talking and explaining and not really convincing anyone, and essentially ending up making no one happy and not really moving forward on South Korea-Japan relations.
The focal point of President Yoon's Liberation Day speech is expected to be South Korea's new vision for unification. Professor Pan, what directions and policies do you anticipate from the Yoon administration regarding the path toward reunifying the two Koreas?
Well, what it looks like can be drawn from what the Yoon administration has stressed so far regarding its diplomatic and security policy. The key concepts of the Yoon administration's external policy can be summarized in 3 points: freedom, human rights, and democracy. First of all, the Yoon administration has defined freedom as a cornerstone for making South Korea continue to prosper, as well as for making it possible for South Korea to rise to a developed country. Second, the Yoon administration has stressed universal values, particularly human rights. In this vein, while criticizing the prior administration's disregard for human rights abuses in North Korea, the Yoon administration defines human rights as one of the key issues for national security. Third, the current administration has put more emphasis on tackling the retreat of democracy around the world. That explains why the Yoon administration hosted the third summit for democracy in March. These 3 key factors are expected to embed it in the Yoon administration's new vision for unification. In particular, all these 3 key concepts accounted for, the new vision could seek a more clarified direction, which is a liberal democracy. The old vision was based on the national community unification formula, which is under 3 principles: independence, peace, and democracy. Meanwhile, the new formula seems to be reformed by clarifying the end state of unification, which is a liberal democracy, neither a unified communism nor a unified autocracy. Since a liberal democracy is embedded in South Korea's constitution, it seems that the administration believes that its new vision matters in preserving its constitution as well. In addition, human rights might be included in the new vision because the Yoon administration has paid tremendous attention to dealing with human rights abuses in North Korea. In the meantime, the denuclearization of North Korea remains to be seen whether the new vision reflects it. To be honest, the denuclearization of North Korea needs to be paid attention to in a situation where Pyongyang attempts to become an officially recognized nuclear power by enhancing its cooperation with Moscow. However, the denuclearization of North Korea is more likely to be mentioned as an aim of nuclear security rather than one part of the new vision for unification, because the link between the 2 concepts might not be clear enough to make it become a policy. All in all, harmonization between unification policy and constitution appears to be the key direction of the new vision for unification. In this sense, a liberal democracy should serve as a focal point.
It's still under the wraps, but the new road to unification is likely to put more emphasis on liberal democracy, freedom, and human rights. Now, unification of the 2 Koreas may still seem like a distant dream, but at least we now have an updated and clear roadmap toward achieving it. All right, we'll leave it there tonight. Thank you, both of you, for your perspectives.
Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for having me.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time Friday. Have a great holiday.
is no greater blessing